I feel like Frank Sinatra.
Hello, good evening, welcome. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on such a hot evening outside. It's much cooler down here. But my name is John Goodall. I'm the architecture editor of Country Life. And I do a podcast with
Clive Asset, and I am a visiting professor at Cambridge.
We do a regular podcast called Your Place Is or Mine. And it's focused on architecture. Clive and I travel around all over the place all the time looking at things. I'm trying to supply the weekly pages on architecture in the magazine. And we often come away in the car having seen things we didn't really expect to see. And we chat away about them. And this is an attempt to sort of bottle up some of that discussion. But this evening, we thought it would be really wonderful to talk about two of the arguably greatest and most familiar historical architects that Britain has ever produced. I think we can fairly say they both...
John, you haven't said why this is the first. Well, this is the first because it's our first live podcast. We have an audience. So we're very thrilled to see everybody here.
So when we see you slumping asleep, we'll know that our podcast is not doing very well. Yeah, no. But so we thought it would be really interesting to look at these two great architects, Lutyens and Wren. Now, Lutyens, all of you will know, obviously, is the figure after whom this building is now named, the Ned. He designed this building. And so we thought we'd split the talk this evening down the middle. We would talk first of all about how this building came to be, talk a little bit about who Lutyens is, and then look at Wren, who is one of the figures that Lutyens hugely admires. Indeed, he has this witticism. He talks about the style of the Renaissance style of his, with a W, which he produces lots of designs in this form, including, indeed, the original offices of Country Life in Covent Garden, which are still there. They're very much in the Renaissance form designed by Lutyens. But we should kick off, I think, with this building because it is an astonishing structure in the city. And I think maybe it's quite interesting, Clive, perhaps we could just paint a little bit of a picture of the world in which this building is rising, the City of London after the First World War. You know, what is it like?
Well, it was a time of tremendous building, and all the big banks, the Midland Bank, this was the headquarters of the Midland Bank. It used to be the biggest clearing bank, I think, in the world at the end of the First World War. Everything had got much bigger because of the First World War. Everything got much more centralized. All these institutions had got bigger. And there were 5 big clearing banks. The Midland had 1,400 offices, so there were a lot of offices throughout the country. But there were 5 big banks, and they were all building gigantic new headquarters. The National Provincial, I think it was, anyway, what became NatWest, is next door. And then next to that is the Bank of England, and that itself was being rebuilt at exactly the same time. So everything, it was like a building site, really. And
it's worth saying that, of course, London had been the victim of bombing in World War I. I mean, it's extraordinary. I've actually just been doing some work on another building, which I'll mention later. The second bombing raid on London using aeroplanes took place on the 3rd of July, 1917. The first bombing raid, nobody had seen the planes, and this took place in broad daylight. And about 20 German heavy bombers came over, and people were so astonished. Initially, they thought they must be friendly because there were so many planes. And they all came out, even when the firing started, they all kind of trooped onto the street to admire what was going on and had to be ushered downstairs. Of course, this is London's introduction to what we now think of going on terribly all around the world, aerial attack. It's a sort of fascinating thing. So London had been damaged. And there is a massive transformation taking place, as Clive says, as a city that's basically still Georgian, it's still largely red brick, is turning into a city that's white, Portland stone, the big institutional buildings.
It wasn't white for very long, though.
It wasn't white for very long.
It was incredibly smoky with all these thousands of coal fires and industry taking place, and power stations, for example, all burning coal and the plume of smoke blowing over London. So the Portland stone went black pretty quickly.
But also, crucially, banks wanted themselves to be, they wanted big buildings, the very reverse of the present state of play where banks become bars. In this period, banks think, if we have big, impressive buildings, people will trust us to put their money in these buildings and look after their interests. And so all the dynamics that are now driving the abandonment of bank buildings were in reverse. This is a world in which banks wish to establish their authority through architecture. And it's a point that you've made really interestingly, because there are a whole series of retained architects, aren't there, for banks, including the Midland.
Well, they all had to do a huge amount of building because they had this vast number of bank branches, because there had been lots of little banks in the Victorian period, and they'd all been centralised into these big five banks. So they had a lot of branch buildings which they had to rationalise, and so they had to build some new branch buildings, and they had to do things with the ones they got and all the rest of it. So there was a lot of architecture going on, and if in any town in the country you can see these Edwardian and interwar bank buildings. They were very often Georgian. Georgian was the style. It was regarded as being solid and respectable, and people could trust it, which was... And the man who was the chairman of the Midland Bank said there was money in this architecture because it was an advertisement for the stability of the bank. They could afford to build these buildings. They were built to last.
So if that sets the scene a little bit of the city in which this is rising, we now need to introduce the figure of Lutyens himself. He's such an intriguing figure, and we could talk the whole evening about him. But, Clive, what about a little bit of an introduction? Because as you may know, Clive has written a rather brilliant short biography, spare his blushes, but it is, and it's short, that wonderful quality.
That's always good.
On Lutyens. So just a little bit of an introduction.
I don't want to torment the readers, or listeners who are outside there, wherever they are, around the world, we believe, after number 12 of our podcast. But they'll be tormented by the thought that there are books that people can buy at the back of this room. Of course, this won't be the case if you're listening at home.
Stop advertising your book, Clive, and tell us about Lutyens.
Well, Lutyens was born in 1869, and he was the son of a painter. The painter had been in the army, but his father had given up to be a painter of horses. He was called Edwin Landseer Lutyens, and Edwin Landseer, those were the names of the famous Victorian painter of horses, and that's what his father wanted to do. He wanted to paint horses and become a very rich and successful Royal Academician. But that never happened, and Lutyens' home life, unfortunately, was very chaotic and rather odd. His father became a bit balmy, to be quite honest. So that was embarrassing. But he grew up in Surrey, which was very, very important for him, and he met at quite an early period of his life when he was in his 20s. He didn't have very much formal education. He was poorly when he was a boy, and he stayed at home and he wandered around the Surrey lanes looking at them all and drawing things. But he was poorly, so he didn't go to school, and he didn't have much architectural education. In fact, hardly any. His big rival, somebody who became a rival, he was a friend to begin with, worked for a long time in an architect's office, the office of George and Peto, and Lutyens just went through in a flash in about a year or something like that. And then he opened his first architectural office at the age of 19, which was incredibly young for an architect, and he was then up and running.
It is worth saying that the way that Lutyens as a boy drew, I've never experimented this with myself, but apparently he took a pane of glass and a sharpened block of soap, and he would go and see a building and he would hold the glass up and then he would trace the details of the building with the soap, and he would remember them. And then he would wipe the glass clean, and then he would go on and do something else. So he's someone who, as a child, is absorbing all these buildings in the most extraordinary way. Have you ever tried drawing with soap, Clive?
I haven't, but a friend of mine did, and I think it's not quite so easy as it might appear. But he had this very, very retentive visual memory. So these things that he saw as he was walking around or wherever he went, he remembered for a long time, and that was very important. That was because it's an extraordinary thing. He started off being this architect who based his style on cottages and farmhouses and these tumble-down buildings in the Surrey lanes, because Surrey wasn't very well off at that time. And his first style was really made. I mean, his very first buildings actually weren't, I don't think, you wouldn't have guessed he was this great genius who he became. But the key was to meet the gardener Gertrude Jekyll, who was a great, great craftswoman. And she knew people like William Morris. She was very signed up to the arts and crafts movement. And she'd been a craftswoman who did all sorts of things like very fine embroidery and inlay work and
photography and journalism.
All these things. Well, she had to do all these things to support herself as an independent lady. She never got married, but she needed this income, so she was set up as a gardener to sell plants to her clients as well as design all these gardens. But she turned to gardening after her eyesight started to go. But she was a sort of card-carrying member of the arts and crafts movement, and she could do everything. She did all these things for the house, all these crafts which were sold to people for their houses. But she didn't actually know how to build one, but she had very strong ideas about what a home should be. And she found this young boy who was very funny, he was very witty, and he was a bit gangly, and he had sort of sticking out hair and his brother's old clothes and stuff. And she took to him, and she invited him to come round, and she sort of saw him that here was somebody she could mould, I think.
And to cut a long story short, she very much moulds him in the arts and crafts tradition. And I think one of the things that's so important about Lutyens is he goes on, of course, in the late 19th and early 20th century to build lots of houses for wealthy people. They often have a wonderful integration of the garden and the house. There's a sense you move between compartments of the house into the garden, a very common idea in the early 20th century.
Well, he and Gertrude Ducal did more than 100 gardens together. So they were, something of a sort of, I was going to say an item, but that would give the wrong impression. She was much older than him. I think had possibly no interest.
But it's true, I think...
Let's not go there.
It's true to say, I think, that but for two episodes, the First World War, which we'll talk about in a moment, but also a commission to design the imperial capital of India, New Delhi, I think Lutyens would have gone down in history as a great designer of houses. He would just have been, like many late Victorian architects, he would have built luxury houses for rich people, and they would have been rather wonderful things. But he'd probably be quite an obscure figure. But in 1911, there is a decision taken to rebuild the imperial capital of India. And there's a board of architects that's appointed, isn't it? I mean, Lutyens is useless at dealing with boards, but he gets the job and he begins to build. And I'm sure many of you have been to New Delhi and seen it. But I think also, before we talk about that, because it's linked to the other great thing, which is the war. And Lutyens has a very good war. He doesn't fight. He seems to travel around.
Well, he was a bit old, to be fair, John.
Sorry, I don't mean to make that sound dismissive, but he is forever travelling around. He's, for example, involved in building the British School in Rome at this time, and there are very funny building accounts where...
Well, that's important in this context, because the British School in Rome is based exactly on St. Paul's. And fun enough, Wren had been very much in the air before Lutyens got hold of it in about 1906. And people thought of it as being very important because they wanted a national style. And Wren was this great national architect. And so Lutyens caught on a bit late, but he did do it very much better than anyone else. And quite how he managed it, I think, is rather difficult to know, because he was untutored. He hadn't learnt this from anybody else. He just managed to pick it up by himself. So it was fantastic, because the Country Life building, which we both blush because I used to work at Country Life for quite a long time, and John now still works there. But it is the most marvellous composition, and that was practically his first. But a masterpiece, straight out of the box, which is extraordinary.
I was going to say about the British School in Rome that one of the funny things about reading the building accounts is that U-boats keep on sinking things such as a complete shipment of sinks that are coming to the building. And what's extraordinary about this is everything is being imported from England in the middle of a U-boat blockade.
Yes.
But Lutyens is, when I say we'll double back, because we want to talk about Wren and how Lutyens begins to play at what he calls the great game of classicism through Wren. But I think it is really important to understand that he is involved in the Imperial War Graves Commission. And in that role, he begins designing war memorials. And of course, the cenotaph in Whitehall is the most famous, which is initially built in timber and canvas. But that monument and the others that he's involved in articulate the grief of a nation. And it's those monuments that actually make Lutyens a household name, I think. So lots of architects build grand buildings, but very, very few architects design buildings that articulate a nation's grief. And I think between New Delhi and the Imperial War Graves Commission, they're the two things that actually set Lutyens apart from nearly everybody else among his contemporaries.
Yes, I think to be a great architect, you have to have great opportunities. And
Yes,
Lutyens
absolutely.
was lucky in that respect. The Edwardian period was expansive, and there were these opportunities. He was also very good at getting them, and he worked very hard. He was always working his contacts and pushing himself forward. And as a matter of fact, his association with country life, which was a very long one, was, well, in the words of the day, it boomed him. It made him. It was always publishing his country houses, and it made him a very big figure, which he hadn't been before. It was rather a new, it was rather a modern idea. The idea that media was going to help you to get a profile and therefore build a career.
And it's worth actually just saying something very briefly about Country Life, because it's founded in 1897, and when it's first published, it's called Country Life Illustrated, because its proprietor, Edward Hudson, who's a massive fan of Lutyens when he meets him, is very interested in printing, and he introduces this half-tone printing process. And before this invention of half-tone printing in the late 1880s in Germany, if you wanted to have a photographic illustration in a magazine, you had to print it and stick it in. This is very expensive for obvious reasons. But with half-tone printing, you can run copy with illustrations in the text. And Country Life is absolutely at the vanguard of this new technology. Within 3 years, everybody has caught up on Fleet Street. And the newspapers in the First World War are all being illustrated with photographs. But just for that very short window of time, it is pretty much one of the only photographically illustrated magazines that's being produced. And Lutyens, as Clive was saying, it takes great advantage of this. His architecture is being promoted through this publication, and it's enormously valuable to him.
Well, it was a time of great technological change, wasn't it, from all points of view, because, of course, electricity was coming in, and so, the machines to look after the house were just being tried out.
And he's involved in that with his houses. But just to go back to Wren,
Wren.
So I mean, we as we've explained, Lutyens sort of begins by being someone who's building houses for rich people in this arts and crafts style. It's very homely, but his ambition is to build in the classical style, isn't it?
Yes, he sort of runs out of the arts and crafts, really, and he finds that he's done enough. And in about 1905 or 6, he thinks that there's this greater aspiration, which is to discover this language of classicism, which goes back for 2,500 years. And he jumps in and he makes a great fist of it straight away. And he calls it the Renaissance with a W. And indeed, the Country Life building, which we've been talking about, is...
Sorry, I think that's a hand blower in the loo next door.
You can never tell what happens on our podcast, can you? We usually record them at home, and there's usually quite lively things happening outside. But that is Wren, but it actually has lots of other influences as well. But Wren, for the Country Life building, and Wren, it's interesting that he was asked to base his design for the British School in Rome very specifically on the upper story of the west front of St. Paul's, and somebody had come to him, somebody from the civil service, and said, we want to have this building in Rome, and we think that would be a jolly good precedent to take, which somehow doesn't sound very likely today.
It is also really important to say there's a bit of historiography to the porch of St. Paul's, and it's really peculiar. In the early 17th century, Inigo Jones, who is the fated classical architect, he's the first sort of idiomatic classical architect in the English tradition. He builds on the front of Old St. Paul's a porch with columns. This porch is massively admired. It's so admired that when Old St. Paul's burns down, Wren redesigns that double-layered portico at the west end of the church, the one you walk in through, with columns of the same dimensions as Inigo Jones's. So when Lutyens quotes, basically for the British School at Rome, it's created for an international art exhibition in Rome. This is a British pavilion for it. They want a building that symbolises national style, and they basically tell him, as Clive has said, to take the top section of that porch and plonk it down in the middle of Rome. It really is as peculiar as it sounds. Of course, what Lutyens does, for those of you who know that building, which is so clever, is he creates a ramp of steps. It's as though if you're facing St. Paul's, he basically chops out the ground floor, drops the sort of pediment, the triangle at the top, to the ground on top of columns, and then uses the flight of steps at the bottom to give it monumentality. But so, in other words, there's a really complicated and rather weird reason for doing this. And notice the technical sort of significance of it. The dimensions of the columns of the portico of St. Paul's are significant because they link it to the 17th century and Inigo Jones. Weird, but true.
But we should talk also about his friend Reginald McKenna.
I'm about to say yes, because coming back to the bank, why this bank? So
we thought we never would.
Yes, you thought we never would. That we've got Lutyens. He's designed things with classical idiom. He's after World War I. The city is being rebuilt. Now, tell us about McKenna. He's a really fascinating character, a politician whom nobody's heard of.
No, well, he was an incredibly important person because he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer for most of 1915. And so that was obviously during the First World War. And so you can imagine the role the Chancellor of the Exchequer played, having to raise all this money and keep feed the engine of war. And yet he was a very, very modest man. He was sort of low church person. He extremely modest. He didn't want anybody to write about him. He didn't want any memoir after his death or anything of that kind. So people haven't really heard of him, but he's an interesting figure. And I was very pleased when I was doing my book that I went to the HSBC archives, which are in somewhere in the East End. And they have quite a lot of his letters. So I felt I got quite close to him in a sense. But he was very close to Lutyens because he had married a girl called Pamela, who was quite a lot younger than him, but she was the niece of Gertrude Jekyll. And Gertrude Jekyll was this person who was so important in Lutyens' career because not only did she try to instill a style in him, but she introduced him to so many people, including many members of her own family. And Lutyens was very, very fond of all these people, and he was very fond of Pamela. And he thought that everybody was getting married to people called Mac something, and so that also became quite an important little joke for him because he rather later in life, he didn't get on, it was difficult with his wife. She became a theosophist and was pro-Indian independence at the time that he was designing New Delhi, which was an embarrassment. And he eventually had this strange relationship with Lady Sackville, who owned Noel, very colourful figure, and they called each other McSack and McNed. It seems
very strange. And then all the correspondence between them was burnt. So
yes,
we don't really know anything. I mean, it should be said that Lutyens, people were always fascinated by Lutyens because he was very amusing, I think, in company. He was very inarticulate, except with a pencil. And so when he was talking, he would draw and he would amuse people with his fingers. And he would, take a menu or a menu card and he would suddenly turn it into a drawing of something, rather like Edward Lear or something. He was brilliant. He was very amusing. And one story, he really liked children and he didn't get on so well, I think it's true to say, with adults. And
well, the funny thing is that he spent very little time with his own children. That's absolutely extraordinary. He loved children. He loved other people's children. He only saw his own children on Sundays.
And he had a very childish sense of humour.
He was a grown-up child, really.
Yes, he was. One of my favourite sort of anecdotes about him is a practical joke he would play on people, that somebody would come to the house and say, do you mind getting electric shocks? And the person would say, no at all. So we'd get out a matchbox and he'd stick one match at the top of the box and then stick another at the other side. And he said, now, if you just take hold of the left-hand match with your left hand and take hold of the right-hand match with your right hand and very, very slowly lift your leg. And when as they raised the leg, he said, do you feel your leg being pulled? It is extremely childish and probably rather irritating to have that done on you, unless you're a 12-year-old child. But it's absolutely characteristic.
I think a whole evening of it was probably a bit much. But anyway, but he got on extremely well with Reginald McKenna, who, when he first met him, was first Sea Lord. And he had a place, because the first thing he thought of was, well, perhaps I could build him a house. But the first Sea Lord has a house in Admiralty Arch. But when he swapped with Winston Churchill and became Home Secretary, he didn't have a house. So then Lutyens did build him a house. But Reginald McKenna was also very interested in architecture, and certainly his brother Theo used to make models of
buildings,
things that they designed. So, whether that was a good quality in a client, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, they had this shared interest. And after the First World War, Reginald McKenna became chairman of the Midland Bank.
Because he didn't stand for Parliament. In the 1918 election, he decides he's not going to stand for Parliament, and so he can take on this chairmanship, which is a big deal, the biggest bank in the world.
Yes, it was fantastic. And they started in about I'm getting confused now. Anyway, in the early 20s, they started to think of the new headquarters. But he also showered a number of other commissions on Lutyens. I mean, Lutyens didn't actually do the whole thing. He just did the sort of fancy parts. But one of the things significantly in the conversation that he wanted his friend Ned to do was design a little bank on Piccadilly. It's sort of about halfway between Piccadilly Circus and the Ritz, if you
just
can
by
imagine.
St James's Church, if you
and
can
that
think.
was the thing.
Yeah.
He wanted Lutyens to do this because St James's Church is designed by Wren, and he thought, wouldn't it be great to set Ned this test of designing a little jewel-like building right next door to his big hero? But it's interesting that Lutyens didn't do it in a Wren style. He did it in the style of a Venetian Mannerist architect called Sansovino, because really, to Lutyens, Wren was just one of the sources he was drawing on for his classical architecture. But it's a beautiful, really brilliant building. But it's actually modelled on the gates, one of the gates of Verona, curious enough, which I don't think Lutyens ever saw. But there were libraries which circulated books to architects and things. You could get engravings and things, and he loved those gates. There was a house in Yorkshire which he based on another gate at Verona.
I suppose it is also one of these very confusing things.
San Michele, I meant to say. Sorry, I said San
yes. I mean, it's one of these very confusing things that people, take ideas from other buildings and then in this very abstract way can convert them into something completely different. It's a confusing detail, but it's a bit like the columns of St. Paul's. What I think we should turn to this building, and then we're going to double back a little bit to Wren as well. But it is this particular building, obviously, it's a headquarters of this global bank. It is, as Clive has already said, it's immediately opposite the Bank of England, which is itself in the process of being reworked. I'm sure many of you are familiar that it's built by Sir John Soane in the early 19th century. And then in the 1920s, the Bank of England basically rip out the heart of the bank building, and it's remodeled by Herbert Baker, who is originally a great friend of Lutyens's, but becomes a great enemy of Lutyens. In fact, they fall out over the construction of New Delhi. Both of them are involved. And it's a very, very childish argument, really. It's all about the placement of Viceroy's House, now Rashtrapati Bhavan, the President's Palace in India, and a hill called Raisina Hill. And Lutyens, they want to blow the top off the hill to create a platform to build, and Lutyens wants Rashtrapati Bhavan, Viceroy's House, to be on top of the hill. And Herbert Baker wants to build the Secretariat buildings, which flank the main access to the palace, on the top of the hill. And they fight a battle about it, and in the end, Lutyens has to push Viceroy's House beyond the top of the hill. And he wittily says that he meets his Bakerloo. And he and Herbert Baker don't speak to one another for a long time, but they do eventually make it up.
Yes, I don't think Lutyens behaves terribly well, to be fair. I think it was entirely his fault. So, poor of Lutyens.
Indeed. And I suppose it's also an interesting point that, it's very difficult to talk about today, but there is an imperial quality to all this architecture. I mean, both Herbert Baker particularly, but Lutyens too, they're both kind of visionaries of an imperial idea of Britain. This is not a country that is just, it's not an isolated island off the northwest of Europe for them. It is the heart of something much greater, and the rebuilding of London that's going on even more widely than this is part of turning London into an imperial capital. This is an important urge in the 20s, and it's actually it's echoed in the early 19th century with George IV and John Nash, the layout of Regent Street and various things like this, where London is kind of taking quantum leaps in its status, trying to make it clear it has the buildings that make it an imperial capital. It's a rather fascinating, but as I say, for modern sensibilities, rather unattractive aspect, I think, of the work that's being done here.
Well, I suppose before the First World War, they were trying to keep up with Vienna and Paris and these other capitals of empires. And also it was the age of the motor car, which was another thing. So they were trying to equip, for example, the great scheme of the Mall, where Admiralty Arches,
yes.
There was what they called a rond-point, a roundabout in front of, that was the first roundabout in the country, I think, in front of Buckingham Palace. But of course, they weren't expecting there to be so many cars.
And it's unbelievable. Actually, it is an imperial route, this. It's worth saying. I don't think many people realise that until the reorganisation of the Mall in the 1910s, the Mall did not go to the front door of Buckingham Palace. It missed it. It went to the right-hand side. And the realignment of the Mall on Buckingham Palace is part of the same endeavour to create a route that runs from Buckingham Palace to Trafalgar Square, runs right down the Strand through Aldwych, which is being demolished with all the Dominion buildings around Aldwych, and right the way through to St. Paul's Cathedral, because that is the axis of empire. So all the buildings that have a view onto that are imperial in character. It's a sort of fascinating a moment in time, and it really,
yes,
I think,
India House and South Africa
exactly.
House,
Yes, exactly, and it's so easy, I think, to take the layout of London for granted, but actually, that axis is conceived and executed quite brutally and cut through the landscape, and it's easy to imagine that Buckingham Palace always had a road running to its front door, but it didn't. That aside.
But to revert to Baker, I feel slightly sorry for him, because he was, it wasn't nearly such a good architect as...
I don't know, I don't think that's true. I think he does do good. He does interesting things.
What do you mean? But still, he'd been head of cricket and head of football at Tunbridge. That was pretty good. Yeah. So he was a sporting person, and he also understood. You see, Lutyens hadn't been to school, and he was conscious when he was growing up. Rather when he was older, when he had grown up, that he found it difficult to be on the same wavelength as his contemporaries who were men, because he hadn't had all this sort of rough and tumble
of public school,
whereas Baker had, and so he was very good at working all these committees, whereas Lutyens was very good at working individual rich men, or being friendly with viceroys' wives and that kind of thing, hoping to get influence that way. In fact, it was, and it was. He wrote to Lady Hardinge, who was wife of one ambassador, that something had gone wrong, and he had displeased her in some kind of way, which I can't quite remember. But he said, "I shall wash your feet with my tears and dry them with my hair. It is true that I have very little hair, but you have very little feet." And what he didn't realize was
creepy.
I thought it was charming. But what he didn't realize was that all this correspondence was regarded as official, so it was therefore published and sent around all the High Commission, much to his embarrassment, as you can imagine. But Baker was a sport himself, and he said of Lutyens, Lutyens was not so generous about Baker, but Baker said of his rival that he was Shakespearean in his architecture. It had this vitality, it had this wit, it had this wonderful beauty of abstract form. And so that was pretty good of Baker, I think.
Yes, he's more generous.
And his interest was more in symbolism, which was not what Lutyens did at all.
It is, of this particular building, of course. It is interesting because the building site is incredibly awkward. It's kind of slightly triangular, isn't it? And
it runs, of course, from Poultry all the way back to, is it Princess Street, I think?
And it's completed, in fact, in the late 1930s, isn't it?
That's a bit of an irony, because it was conceived for a time when everything was on the rise, and when they thought that buildings like this were going to be for entertaining clients and wining and dining them, and there were going to be lavish parties and stuff. Of course, by the time it opened, the world had changed. There'd been the crash and there'd been the depression, and so it was more about getting deals to bail people out, and it was all a bit grim.
But it's, thinking of iconography, I'm sure you've noticed it. On the corners of the building, in celebration of Poultry, Poultry Lane, there are there little boys holding sort of seem to strangle geese as little figures, and it's also, I mean, internally the opulence of it. I mean, the
But the boys caused this joke. You know, there was the joke about the boys.
No, tell me, what's the joke about the
boys?
boys?
It was the golden goose, and were they killing it or not? But that wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be a reference to poultry, because there had been a market selling poultry. Yeah.
And the opulence, I mean, the malachite columns and upstairs, I don't know if you've
Verdite.
Is it? Sorry.
Yes, it's this material which comes from South Africa.
But I mean, they're fantastic.
Nerdy comment, I'm afraid.
Well, quite right. Correct. I'm used to being corrected by Clive.
You know, one's blue, one's green, John.
But I mean, it's so valuable in themselves. I mean, if you know, do look at them. They are absolutely astonishing pieces of stone. I mean, they're amazing things. The design is sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that thinking of Baker's comment about this abstract form, that was one of the things that is really great about Lutyens, is that he went beyond his models, beyond Wren, and he developed this abstract language of architecture in his late buildings, like this and like the designs for Liverpool Cathedral. And indeed, I think perhaps it developed out of his war memorials. He built one at a very bad place on the Somme called Thiepval, which was, it had to show plaques with names on, and they're all carved in this beautiful Roman lettering. And there's 72,000 names, and they're the names of the people whose bodies were never recovered. Because if anybody could be recovered, even if it wasn't known who they were all buried. That's the way that the British government had decided to do it. But because of the nature of this terrible, terrible fighting and all these battlefield cemeteries, burial grounds being ploughed up again by endless shelling, there were 72,000 people whose bodies were never found. Anyway, that's what Thiepval commemorates, but it's in the form of a triumphal arch. Well, in Rome, triumphal arches have got a tall arch in the middle and two on either side, but essentially they're flat. They're not three-dimensional. Whereas Lutyens's arch is so fully three-dimensional. Well, for one thing, he had to fit in all these names on the walls, which was an incentive. But it's interpenetrated by arches from the side, and so it's, in a sense, it's not as beautiful as his other buildings. I think it's rather deliberately, possibly it's huge, and it's not like the other buildings in Picardy, which are in white limestone, which is in sympathy. They're horizontal, the ones Lutyens has designed, so they're in sympathy with the form of these chalk downs. But it's brick, and it's very upstanding. You see it from miles and miles and miles. It raises right. They didn't have the trees when Lutyens designed it, but the trees planted around it, and it rises right up above these trees, and it's this very, very vigorous three-dimensional composition.
I mean, just creating the surfaces for 72,000 names to be carved it's quite an interesting intellectual problem, isn't it? And it does, as Clive says, as being three-dimensional, it does accommodate that. It's extraordinary.
Yes, but it's abstract. There was nothing, it's like the cenotaph. There was nothing apart from a wreath on it. There was no Christian symbolism or any cross.
And he's very important.
Which the other architects were interested in.
And it is important that of the three architects who are involved in the Imperial Wargrave Commission, one is Baker, one is Blomfield, who's really a Victorian survival, and Lutyens argues very powerfully that there mustn't be any religious symbols because people of all faiths and none have died on the battlefields from all over the world. And that's his great legacy. And if you go to see the monuments in war graves, you will see that it's got the regimental badge, the name, not their rank, and then just a single expression. I think Lutyens didn't want it, but a single phrase carved by the family on it. So it's quite an interesting and very formal.
Or if they didn't know who it was, but they recovered the body, they said, "Known unto God."
Yes. I worry that as time runs out on us, we're going to get away without talking about Wren at all, because I think we need to double back a little bit, don't we, and discuss something about Wren before. And we thought we would talk a little bit less than an hour, because it's such a hot evening that we might be merciful to have less than an hour of Clive and I, but there will be questions afterwards. But yes, Wren, whose career in some ways follows that Lutyens in odd ways.
Well, we're going to talk particularly about St. Paul's, is that right?
Yes. Well, yes. But I mean, I suppose it's important to say at the outset that Wren is also not someone who's trained formally in architecture. He's a mathematician by training. And his, this extraordinary way in which in the past people could fall into architecture, even if they didn't have any formal training. Because, of course, in Wren's London, there is no formal training. But he travels, we do know he travels to France, Paris being the place where great buildings can be admired. He absorbs a lot of ideas from French monumental architecture, the world of Louis XIV and so forth.
I suppose you could say that, like Lutyens had these great opportunities because of the age where he lived in, and he managed to get hold of them as well and make something of them. But in a sense, this man who started out as being a mathematician and an astronomer, but morphed into architecture, that was very lucky too, because, the Great Fire of London, although a complete disaster, was a great opportunity for architecture. And also he stayed in post for such a long time at a moment when the British, or the English monarchy, as it then was, it British? Anyway, was trying to catch up with Louis XIV and what was happening on the continent. And so there was a lot of building. Charles II never really made very much of his attempts to build a palace because he couldn't. But William III, when he came, certainly did with Hampton Court and Kensington Palace. So Wren had these opportunities and he stayed in post until he was an old man.
And I suppose it's important to draw a parallel for Wren and for Lutyens. Geometry is hugely important. There's mathematical. There's a very, very close relationship between architecture and maths and geometry. And in origin, this is a Roman and also a medieval idea that in architecture, you're creating in 3 dimensions an extension of God's order through geometry. That everything can be measured, and these forms, they're man-made versions of a kind of divine order. And I think that's very important for Wren. It's also, I think, curiously important for Lutyens. If you were to talk, when he describes the cenotaph, for example, he explains to people that the sides of the cenotaph are not straight, and the top of the plinth is not straight. It forms part of a circle that has a centre 360 feet below the ground or something, notionally. It's really weird because when people tell you this kind of thing, you think, well, that's all very interesting, but so what? Where did you get the figure from in the first place? What's significant about that? And I have to say that in many ways, I couldn't really give you an answer.
No, I think it's very difficult. And it's very difficult to know where he got it from because he was this boy who hadn't been to school and he hadn't been to university, for example. And so, his father, although being a bit of a nutcase at the end of his life, had been in the army and he had invented a rangefinder for the artillery. So he must have known something. That would have been a mathematical tool. So there might have been something in the family, but it's a strange thing. It was almost like an innate thing for him. And we see it on this very building, because if you look up at the facade on Poultry, you'll see that the rustication, which are these bands, they're called rustication, each band steps backwards by a tiny fraction. It's a tiny fraction of an inch. And it was a very exact fraction. And again, nobody quite knows, I don't think, why that very fraction was chosen.
I think it's 0.27777 infinity.
And so this drove his draftsman absolutely bonkers. And they said to him, well, because he kept on changing it. And every time he changed it, they had to draw the whole thing out again. And so they said to him, well, won't some degree of error creep in when the masons build it? Couldn't it be about that? And he said, no, about? There's no about in the case. He couldn't imagine anything that was less than the perfect ratio, however it was that he had come upon it. And he came upon different ratios and he changed it from time to time as the building was being constructed or being designed, I think. But that's this is a very abstract building too, isn't it, John? There's almost, the classical tradition of architecture is about all this ornament. And there's almost none of that, barely columns, barely capitals, barely, all the other things that get put on classical buildings.
Yes, it's almost a styleless building, this, except at the very top.
And geometrical.
But, I mean, the important thing is that both Wren and Lutyens are, in a way, playing this strange game. And I think Clive is absolutely right that the crucial thing for understanding Wren's career is the canvas he's given. It's the rebuilding of London. And of the major buildings that you could rebuild in London, nothing could be more important than St. Paul's. You know, it is the cathedral of this great city. It's being rebuilt at a time where London itself is for the first time growing into an imperial capital. This is the moment where Britain's empire is beginning to develop on a grand scale for the first time, and principles of how you manipulate money are making Britain wealthy in a way that has never been the case before. Really interestingly, you know, into the 16th century, if you want to buy luxury goods, you generally have to go to Holland. And that's the entrepot for luxury goods in Europe. By the end of the 17th century, if you want luxury goods, you come to London. This is where they're all entering, you know, Europe. And London fashions, London architecture, really, really important. So Wren is also riding an imperial bubble in a curious way. And St. Paul's, I mean, we could do an entire talk on St. Paul's. It's far too complicated. But of course, in an English context, it is the defining and first classical cathedral. All other cathedrals, to state the obvious, in Britain at the time are Gothic or medieval. And also, it has a dome of a scale that nobody has seen before in Britain. And you know, where do you think of great domed churches? Well, it's Rome, it's St. Peter's. It's borrowing, again, these imperial attributes and recreating them in London. In St. Paul's, he makes really interesting use. Now the building has been cleaned, it is really interesting if you look at the dome, how he uses different stone types in the drum of the dome. And of course, he has this extraordinary structure. It's a great structural achievement to complete the dome over St. Paul's. And I think it's 1702, isn't it, that the work is finished. So we're already in the reign of Queen Anne from, you know, Charles II. What we've said before about the references for Wren, classical architecture is seen in England through the prism of this figure, Inigo Jones, who I mentioned before, who works in the court of Charles I and designs the first idiomatic English classical buildings. And that creates, in effect, a sort of a descent from Inigo Jones to Wren. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, people look back to Wren as the father of English classical architecture. And that's one of the reasons why the Renaissance of Lutyens' world is so important. It is, as Clive was saying, creating a British style for an imperial Britain. This is a new Rome being created.
I think the late 17th century was thought to have been a good time.
Yeah.
Whether accurately or not, but there was, you know, one of the foundation myths was the Glorious Revolution, when William III came in supposedly bloodlessly, except of course it wasn't in Ireland, and deposed James II, who was Catholic, of course, and William III was Protestant. And so the constitutional monarchy, etc., devolved from that. So people look back to the second half of the 17th century as being something to emulate. And so, you know, Wren was associated with all that, with the founding of the Royal Society and advances in science and art. And, you know, we were establishing ourselves on the world stage. So it had a great meaning for people, I think.
And I think it's important not to underestimate the importance of that wonderful World War II photograph of the dome of St. Paul's standing unbroken through the clouds of smoke, as you know, during the bombing campaign in the Blitz. I think that St. Paul's does remain. It has a unique status in planning in London, these sight lines towards it that are meant to be protected. And St. Paul's, I think, is one of these buildings that in a very unusual way has come to sort of characterizing the capital. It signifies the capital. That's an extraordinary achievement in a city with so many major buildings, and it still does so. So I feel that continues. And if I may, just as a final point.
Not quite final.
Not quite final. Well, I was going to come through to Clive, because the other thing that Clive has written about recently is the involvement of now the King, then the Prince of Wales, in architecture. And of course, one of the great planning debates that surrounded, the then Prince of Wales became involved with, was the redesign of Paternoster Square beside St. Paul's.
Yes, another book available at the back of the room at an astounding discount.
But I mean,
what I was personally saying, John, was that I called my Lutyens book, Edwin Lutyens, The Greatest British Architect, ? And I was not quite confident enough to say that he was the greatest British architect, because there are obviously architects like Wren and so on. But Wren is one that you would immediately think of as being the greatest British architect. But I wonder whether, I don't know what you think, they always seem rather stiff. You know, he always never quite seems to have stopped being a mathematician and a geometer, whereas Lutyens had this instinctive, innate, three-dimensional imagination, which was sensational and very dramatic. And, of course, he did design, although perhaps, fortunately, this was never finished, but the crypt was built, a cathedral for Liverpool on a scale which was far surpassing that of St. Paul's. Not that necessarily makes it a good building in itself, but it is. And there's a great model which is 17 feet long in the Museum of Liverpool, which is really worth seeing.
Which is fun. If you've never seen it, do go. It is the greatest cathedral never built. I mean, it's completely
and even as a matter of fact, the hall just outside here is rather like the crypt which was built.
Yes, indeed.
That use of the stone, the travertine, and the engaged columns and so on.
And which has in one corner of it a very bizarre, you know, for the entombment of Christ at Easter, when the stone is rolled away, one of the doors in the crypt actually is a huge rolling stone, a slab of stone that you can pull from side to side.
That was where the treasury was. And this great big disc of stone, which has holes carved in it, could be rolled. I think they can't roll it very far now.
Well, probably health and safety forbids, probably, but it's
but I think it is still technically possible to roll it. They just don't do it very often. But it could be rolled and became the gate of this treasury, and you could look through and see the splendours of this cathedral, such as they were, because it was a new cathedral, and of course probably didn't have very many splendours, but it was all intensely symbolic and rather emotional, even if you aren't a Catholic.
Yes, it's an amazing building. It is interesting. I mean,
I think Wren was a bit of a dry old stick.
Well, I feel just by your saying it, I'm driven to defend him. You know that I do think that particularly St. Paul's, there is something quite extraordinary about it. I mean, it feels. It's a building you need to walk around inside, and in some ways it's slightly cold, I think, but it has real dynamism. And I think that I suppose for both Wren and for Lutyens, in my view, off the cuff, both of them they create wonderful spaces that you can move through. The rooms they both build are surprisingly boring. I mean, Lutyens' rooms in his houses are very dull, but the way you move between them is often fantastically exciting. They're the kind of places where you need to look up when you're walking between places. But if you sit down in the dining room or the drawing room, it's actually quite a dull
somewhere
space.
Like Castle Drogo is like a sculpture, really, isn't it? By the way, should we let people go, do you think?
I think we've got to the stage. We've done exactly 50 minutes, and I think if people feel strong enough, it's time for questions. Gosh, straight away. Yes, please.
We speak about the king and his involvement in the architecture scene and decisions. And recently, he wasn't actually involved in the decision making of the Queen's Memorial, which was notably won by someone who did have a little debacle with him, who critiqued him, which was Lord Norman Foster.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you feel that Lord Norman Foster winning that architectural design for the Queen's Memorial in St James's Park being the last jewel in the crown that he needed to kind of go into the calibre of Wren or Lutyens?
Well, it's an interesting. I was looking at all the design. This isn't trying to dodge the question, but I was just struck by how much remains to be decided about about the winning plan. You feel almost as though the process has got together a group of architects, and it's just a sort of proposal, and they haven't chosen a sculptor, and they haven't really chosen very much about what's going to happen at all.
But the centrepiece is a sort of fairly conventional equestrian sculpture, which is for him. Isn't that amazing?
It is. Well, I think it's so funny in the city, you know, when you go to Richard Rogers's, the Lloyd's building, you go to the top floor and it's suddenly got an interior from Bowood from the 18th century plonked in the side. And it's a really amusing, detail, isn't it? How even these architects, I mean, I'm sure he wasn't given a choice about that, but it's quite interesting that there are these inflections of style. I don't know. I mean, I think that the bridge in the park is eminently replaceable. I struggle I really struggle with the visualizations of what's being produced to think that it's going to be a great success. But then, in fairness, I feel as though almost nothing has been properly designed yet, and it's all still to play for. So let's hope.
Another question.
Any other? Or are we all exhausted? Oh, yes, this gentleman.
I work in insurance, so I love the Lloyd's building and all the kind of architecture around insurance and built the companies that occupy the buildings. What are your thoughts on the Lloyd's building and say the Leadenhall building that were designed by these architecture firms that obviously they take into account the sightlines? I think the architecture in London is special because of that, but you might be able to.
Well, I think the Lloyd's building isn't like these towers which have gone up recently. I mean, it was it was a great building of its type. But you may not like the type. I have to admit that there was a building there before by somebody called Sir Edwin Cooper, which some of us thought ought to have been kept, but actually it was terribly dull. I mean, the Lloyd's building is much, much better. But I think what's happened recently is that we've had this rash of towers by people who seem to have not nearly the talent that you're talking about there. And I think those are a disaster. And I think nobody really quite understands how it's happened, because it was not a democratic decision that was put before the public. It was successive mayors of both stripes. And we've got them. And they are extraordinarily intrusive, and very few of them are any good.
Yes, I used to have really strong views about buildings, but now I only have strong views about buildings that aren't trying. And I think what Clive refers to, what you see time and time again in the city is a new building, let's say like the Gherkin, huge amount of thought went into it, really well designed, really thought through, it's built. And as soon as it's built, every other developer says, well, that's the precedent, and then with no thought at all, throws up lots of other buildings. So, for example, with the Gherkin, one of the justifications for the design was that it echoed the dome of St. Paul's. Well, they're not even intervisible anymore. So much other stuff has gone up in between. So I feel that when I like the difference of the Lloyd's building. I think it's a sadness that it's already in doubt as to whether it's going to remain the headquarters of Lloyd's. I mean, it's a reminder of what incredibly short-term building, how little time these buildings are being used. And I mean, the Shard is another building that's won popular approval. I don't much like it myself, but it's definitely trying. But, think about this. The Shard has all that triple glazing on. It probably has a life of about 25 to 30 years before all the seals on the glass go. Well, St. Paul's has been re-leaded once since it was completed in 1702. And imagine what the Shard's going to look like when they have to put new glass back on it. I mean, it's an enormous undertaking. And so I think the failure to think through the implications of this architecture is shocking. But I actually quite like, I like the diversity. And whenever anything tries, it's good for me.
I think when, London would have been a building site after the First World War, when all these buildings, Poultry was a sort of row of rather indifferent Victorian little
terraces.
Well, they weren't even really terraces. They were sort of shops and things, but they were very small scale and insignificant. And you could have said, "Wow, this building is so much bigger in scale," but this building is continuing a language. And when Lutyens died, Christopher Hussey wrote this wonderful, wonderful biography of him, and he imagined that it might have been possible to take his late style, this abstract style, and there could have been a kind of school of architecture which followed. I mean, this didn't happen at all, because the Second World War made everybody want things to be completely renewed and the old to be swept away, and all these new towers to be put up. So that didn't happen, but he was continuing this language which was in dialogue with what had gone before, whereas what we do now isn't. And I think that's a pity, but I don't know that there's any way back from that.
I also, just one other thought about this. I think if you want to understand what London must have felt like in the 1920s, you should go to Liverpool, for those of you who know it, because you've got that amazing juxtaposition of these huge new towers being thrown up by one of the wealthiest cities in the world at the time, and then all these Georgian terraces. And it's a really weird juxtaposition, and you can sort of get a feel for how London must have felt with this new Americanized architecture coming through what was still a Georgian city. Anyway, hope that answers Some kind of question. No, thank you. Yes.
Are there any buildings being planned in London at the moment that you think will be admired in 125 years?
That's a really good question. I'm sure that yes, but I just now need to think of them. I think they're.
Well, a lot of very good new buildings are in dialogue with old ones. I mean, they're ones which are taking existing architecture. I mean, for example, and this isn't new, but I mean, something like Tate Modern, I think, is extraordinarily successful. Bankside Power Station, Battersea Power Station has been, rather overdeveloped, but it's another example of development which is, taking vitality. And both parts in the equation seem to be gaining from it, and that seems to be something which happens a lot now.
Also, one of the things I most enjoy about Paternoster Square with St Paul's is I love. People tend to think that when you have cathedrals, think of Westminster Abbey or other great cathedrals, that if you sometimes need to clear buildings from around them because otherwise you don't get a clear view of them, and so people often sort of clear around these buildings. I think it does a lot of damage. And in Paternoster Row, as it's been rebuilt, there's a new street called Cannons Row, which is aligned with the north transept of the St Paul's, so it's on the other side from the river, and it's really narrow, and when you walk along it and down it, you get this fantastic strip view of St Paul's. And you don't, the beta buildings, I think we always go on about alpha buildings, the ones that we think are really important. It's like talking about St Paul's and the Bank of England and this building, but in streetscapes it's the beta buildings that show off the alpha buildings. And so actually I think in London there are actually quite a lot of good beta buildings going up as well, and when they're laid with consideration for what exists at present, it augments. But when they're put up with no consideration, they detract. And but that's another thing. I think Paternoster Square will remain as it is for a long time, and I love that little keyhole view through.
Actually, now I think about it, I was taken around. I was a judge of an award a couple of years ago, and I was taken around loads of buildings. All the judges were taken around to see these different buildings, which were sort of on the beta scale. None of them were great monumental ones, but they were very good, many of them, and I was very encouraged by that. And there was a lot of very good social housing, and a lot of it was in brick. And architects had taken, obviously, great trouble over the choice of the brick and also a response to their surroundings. So I was, I found there was quite a lot I could like in that. So I wasn't downcast.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Do you consider the new HSBC headquarters opposite Paternoster Square a beta building?
Isn't. Do you know? I'm actually now trying to visualise it clearly in my. Is it the one?
It's between Paternoster Square and part of the old London Wall, and it's very inoffensive. It sort of has round corners.
I do know the one you mean. Yeah, I think it's not. Yes, and in an environment where things are gradually growing up and up and up and up, and generally have sheer sides. A lot of the buildings that are being constructed to make the most of the ground plan, I think it is actually rather a thoughtful building. But it's not. It's interesting when you mention. I don't immediately think, oh yes, I know that building. But it certainly doesn't offend.
I think for what it's worth, I'd like to live in a beautiful city, but given the choice, I would prefer to live in a dynamic city. And we live in a dynamic city, and so there are all these things changing around us, which cause contrasts and clashes and things. And that's always slightly been even the English kind of way of looking at things. I mean, the contrast is Paris, which is a city of great beauty, but I would hesitate to say, and particularly if there are French people in the audience, it's a bit of a morgue.
But you just did.
It's a beautiful morgue. It's a beautiful morgue. I mean, I don't deny it's beautiful. It's the city of light.
I don't subscribe to this view. Are there any other questions? Oh yes, right at the back. Yeah.
Curious on your thoughts on the Kensington Olympia building. There's a huge, massive construction underway.
Do you know? I don't know enough about it. Do you know?
No, I passed it. I'm afraid I don't know it sufficiently well. What I know is Nine Elms Lane, because I live in Pimlico, which is quite a long way from 9 Elms Lane. And until quite recently, you didn't see anything in Pimlico which was really higher than the level that Cubitt had built it in the middle of the 19th century. And, for example, there were the churches. Well, they had spires which stuck up, and I can think of one which was floodlit at night. Not a particularly great church, but still, it was a monument in this area. And now our view has been invaded by these towers, which are very, very tall, which are quite a long way away. They're right on the other side of the river, so they're a long way away. And we don't have that sense. Our sense, and my children's sense, of being the place where they grew up has completely changed because of these terrible speculative buildings, which are full of people who don't live here, which are a long way away. And so that those buildings have had an impact, a vast impact, way beyond their immediate locality. And that's the thing about architecture. I mean, it's an art which you can't escape. Every other kind of art, if it's in an art gallery, you don't have to go into the art gallery, or you don't have to go into the concert hall to listen to the music, or maybe you can put on headphones and avoid the radio. But architecture, nobody can escape it. So it makes it a very important subject.
Yes, I'm sorry not to be able to answer. Apologies. No apologies. Yes. Oh.
If you could demolish one building.
So at the back, if you could demolish one building in London, what would it be? Do you want to?
Well, I think buildings like the walkie-talkie are awful.
Yeah.
And that's simply because it's so lumpen as a building. I've been inside it. It's great to look out of. But I think that could be improved.
Have you been on the terrace to look at it?
Oh,
well, I have. Yes, well, we hope to go there afterwards, don't we, John?
I think that it's. I mean, I know that there's been Sorry, this isn't actually spinning off this, because I actually agree. I think the walkie-talkie is the ugliest building that has been erected in the square mile. But I think that there's now another one which has just been given planning permission, which will spoil the view up towards the west front of St Paul's, which is also pretty nasty. But it's not built yet, so we can't really judge it.
But it is a very funny thing that my generation, mostly, really, really hated brutalism when it was put up. And I still do. But I notice that isn't universal.
No,
it puzzles me, John.
I also think I think it's a sadness that we haven't invested more in our bridges in London, because I know they've been relit recently.
Defensive brutalism. You like it.
No, well, I just think that our bridges are incredibly disappointing, and the wonderful view of London that I think is most important is the one across the Thames when you're walking up and down the Thames. And I think that the bridges, although they've been relit and it's really interesting what's been done to them, nevertheless, that river frontage is somehow not flattered. And now there are those terrible barriers to stop cars from killing cyclists running along. I mean, they're just so shabby and horrible. And they could be so grand, I think. And we really have failed with our bridges. So maybe with the Queen's
Riverside
Memorial,
generally.
And the Riverside, I mean, they're unfortunate decisions, aren't there, that have been taken. But it's easy somehow to see the mistakes when they're made. But, yeah. Sorry, yes.
A question about Clive and John. Throughout your working career, what would be your favourite project that you've worked on in an architectural aspect?
Oh, well...
I can plunge into...
Yes.
I wrote a huge book, which I don't recommend you buy because it's too big, on castles, and I really enjoyed...
That's a fantastic book.
I really enjoyed...
Everybody should have it.
Putting it together. It was a huge amount of fun and lots of travel and lots of different things. So I massively enjoyed that. That was very
I went into I was talking to somebody who was a vicar who was also a bell ringer, and she said that sometimes in bell chambers, when people are a bit short, they have things to stand on. And actually, sometimes they're old Bibles because they're so big. But, a copy the English castle would serve very well for that job.
It would, unfortunately.
It's the biggest book ever. I'm very lucky because I really, really enjoyed all the things that I've done, and I've been able to go on doing them, which is, is completely brilliant. I suppose that I was lucky enough to be editor of Country Life for a long time, and actually that was a pretty good gig.
Yeah.
I think that probably is difficult to beat because you can do so many things. And a very good moment was 1997. it was a bad moment in a sense because everything was going wrong in the sort of perspective of country life for various reasons, political partly. But anyway, everything was going wrong. And then we had foot and mouth disease and BSE and everything was going wrong with the countryside. Oh, the hunting ban, which was almost endlessly debated. But that was very good for a journalist because you had loads and loads of things to write about. And also, that was 1997 was our centenary. So we had all these things. And so for the first time, we did a garden. First and only time, we did a fabulous garden at the Chelsea Flower Show. It was simply brilliant. You could do anything that year. That was the annus mirabilis, as far as I was concerned.
Before my time. There we are. Are there any other questions? Or are we all exhausted, I think? Thank you very, very much indeed for being such an engaged audience. It's a real pleasure, and I hope you've enjoyed the evening this evening.
Thank you, too, to the Ned for inviting us to this most glamorous of spaces.
And Clive's books are over there. I'll advertise them for him.
Did anybody
Did anybody mention Clive had written a book or two? There they are.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Thank you also to the Ned for hosting us for the recording. If you would like to discover more about your places or mine, do visit our website, www.wipeonpod.com. There you can sign up for a newsletter which will share news and photos of what we're up to. And join us next week. We shall then be discussing His Majesty King Charles's very understandable love for Romania and what makes Transylvania, where he has 2 homes, so special. See you next week, I hope.